Hi, I'm Dr. Ed Boudreaux, President of Rocky Mountain Creation Fellowship. I was a professor of chemistry and chemical physics at the University of New Orleans before we got blown away by Hurricane Katrina back in 2005 and came here to Colorado. So it's been a blessing to be here and to be part of this organization. And I'm really pleased to be able to address you again on the topic regarding a new book called God Created the Earth. Some of you may remember a prior presentation I made a number of months ago when the first edition of the book was published, and I discussed an overview of the contents of the book. At that time, the issue of Canopy above the earth was not included in the book, but in the recent second edition that's come out earlier this year, we do have that as a second addendum to the book, which is a topic that we will address today. Now, prior to getting into the discussion of the Canopy model, we have to backtrack a little bit to the origin and the nature of the Earth's magnetic field. And that will be the first topic of discussion. In the model that we have presented for the formation of the Earth, remember water was the key substance that God had created right at the beginning of day one. And we envisioned that water to be transformed into a plasma, most of it. And that was forming, well, eventually would form all the chemical elements and the substances that we needed to form the Earth, as well as everything else in the universe, as Russell Humphrey believes, that the water of the universe is out, even on the outer edges of the universe, which we can't even detect anymore. But it was the source of all the material composition of the universe. Well, a portion of that water should have been set aside somewhere in the region of the mantle and the core that would be, available to do its work in the properties that we're going to discuss regarding the Earth's magnetic field. Now, current status is that based on seismic data, it's presumed that the core is primarily composed of iron and nickel, plus some lesser amounts of different elements, and only because the waves reflect a density that fits a model alloy of that kind of composition. The source that I considered to be pretty reliable and complete is by McDonough, whose data says that the formula for the substance in the inner core would be this Fe 200 parts nickel, 12 parts silicon, 7 parts, and chromium 2 parts, having a density of about 7.48 grams per cubic centimeter at 1 atmosphere of pressure. However, as the pressure gets enormously elevated, density will increase tremendously in the neighborhood of 10 to 11 grams per cubic centimeter, which is what the core density is believed to be now. Now, the inner core is actually ferromagnetic because of the presence of the iron and the nickel, and the electrons that are there align themselves to form a ferromagnet. But the high core temperature cancels out this magnetism because it's above what's called the Curie point. And at the Curie point, if you go beyond the Curie point, rather, the ferromagnetic properties of any substance will be lost, and you will have no longer the magnetism that was available originally. The outer core has presumably a composition of essentially nonmetals: silicon, oxygen, phosphorus, and hydrogen. Basically, this formulation was considered to be the composition by McDonough, and that has a much lower density of about 1.7 grams per cubic centimeter, as you can see right here. So we have these components in the outer core, but it's believed that there are some ionized atoms within that molten medium of the outer core which circulate around the inner core, and that creates a dynamo via the Faraday effect for the electric field to be induced into the inner core as a magnetized system. And that would be the source of the core field, which at this point in time in the Earth is only about 25 Gauss and about a half a Gauss at the surface. So it's a pretty weak field now. The question is, was it always a weak field? And here's the model that was proposed by Baxter and me, based upon the plasma Earth concept, that the portion of the water of the creation was set aside naturally for the lakes and the oceans and so on, but there was an additional portion that was committed to the region, interior region of the Earth, in the mantle core area, and those subterranean waters would be part of the waters of the fountains of the deep that the Bible speaks about. And we also have some relevant evidence from fairly recent data that it suggests that there is a body of water in that mantle region of the core, which is as big as maybe the Arctic Ocean. So it's a fairly sizable amount of water even there today. So if we consider that water in the inner core and the temperature of the core approaching a pretty, of course, the original temperature, remember, was much higher than a million degrees. It was like 10 to the 10th, which is 10 billion degrees. But if it lowers down to about a million degrees, any water that had not been dissociated into plasma would then be dissociated into hydrogen and, atoms and OH groups as well, considering the energy necessary for that, 446 kilocalories per mole at 10 to the 6 Kelvin. So we would get these two entities, the hydrogen atoms and the HO groups, and these entities have unpaired electrons on them, and they are going to be the components then that could be organized together either by natural means as the pressure is increased, forcing them into a metallized state, and then causing the alignment of those spins to create a magnetic field as a permanent magnet, a ferromagnet, and at extreme temperature of about 20,000 kilopascals, which is 200 million atmospheres, at a temperature of 100 million degrees, 10 to the 8th K. So we're talking about a pretty fairly energetic environment here in the early Earth. But if we then look at properties of different things that have been reported in the literature, how they would behave as the temperature is at this level and the pressure is increased greatly to a level like this, we could see that there would be a density of this environment, of this separated components of water, that would be in the neighborhood of maybe 11 to 12 grams per cubic centimeter, which is in the right order of magnitude as the current density of the core of the Earth today. So that would then agree with any seismic data that might even be measured today. Now there are 8 electron spins that would align in one cubic unit cell, if we consider it to be a cubic arrangement, into a magnetic alignment. And the total thing would end up being 10 to the 43 power magnetically aligned electron spins, which is based on a mass of water that's approximately 3 times 10 to the 28 power kilograms. So that's the amount of water that has been decomposed into the H and HO groups. Now the magnetic field, without going into a lot of details and computations, the magnetic field that would be derived from that is about 0.13 million Gauss, which is exceedingly greater than the 25 Gauss of today's field. And then in the outer core, those H and OH groups would have picked up electrons to become ions, H minus and HO minus, and they would circulate about the core in very much the same way that the present theory of the dynamo action is conceived, and they would induce an additional magnetic field of about 14,000 Gauss. So when you put it all together, you get a total field of 0.144 million Gauss coming out of the Earth's core. Now that's 5,760 times greater than the Earth's current magnetic field, and at the surface, this would approximately be around 367 Gauss, as opposed to a surface of 0.5 Gauss as it is in today's Earth. Now, that 367 Gauss is subject to a little variation depending upon where you consider the origin of the field to actually be and the extent to which it goes onto the surface. So it can vary by 100 plus or more Gauss. But the bottom line is it's substantially increased magnetic field in this primordial Earth at the Earth's surface. Now, that would not only have had some positive influence with regard to longevity, as some people have believed, but it would definitely improve the quality of life, animal life and plant life particularly, and you would get a more effective shielding on the Earth from the cosmic radiation that could possibly come in under those conditions. And in fact, it has been shown in the barometric pressure experiments by Dr. Carl Baugh down in Glen Rose, Texas, that with conditions that would have an increased magnetic field at elevated pressure and so forth, you do get much improved growth in plants. You get improved behavior of growth and well-being of some animals. And so he's doing these studies right now on these barometric chambers, what these effects would be like. Now, after the flood, Humphreys has shown that the Earth's magnetic field would have gone through wild oscillation from a very large value perhaps to a very small value, up and down, until the flood had subsided. The energetics of the flood would have caused that situation. And so it would go through these wild oscillations and then gradually level off in time and just deplete in a rather smooth, almost linear fashion to the very low field that it is today. And that would be, of course, important to remember, because if we started with a high field in the Earth initially, we would not have ended up with a high field after the flood. Certainly is not the case because the field's very weak today. Okay, so the waters which God initially used in the model of creating the Earth for all material composition and the chemical properties and physical properties are the waters of creation, which of course became the waters of destruction in the flood. And so God's metaphor of water is not only realistic, but it occurs over 300 times in the Bible, the significance of water. And we have to keep in mind that God is orchestrating all of the creation, that we can try to scientifically model different aspects of it and maybe just go so far with the science that would be supposedly and hopefully in agreement with the biblical account, but some point eventually God's miraculous involvement is involved, and so we may or may not be able to model everything adequately. For example, I mentioned the alignment of those electron moments to form a strong magnet. Now, in that system that we envision here, that could happen quite naturally under the right pressure and conditions of the inner Earth. In Humphreys' model, those are moments of the hydrogen atoms on the water molecules, which are nuclear magnetic moments that are much, much weaker than electron moments. And Humphreys invokes the miracle of God to align those moments on the water in order to generate his model of how that magnetic alignment would have induced a permanent field into the Earth's core. So we could invoke miraculous involvement too, just as well. But I'm just trying to show you the comparison between the two approaches. Okay, moving on. Now, an overview of God created the firmament. And here's what I want to point out to you. The word firmament, the rakia in the Hebrew, is the word that's used. And God said, let there be a firmament, makia, in the midst of the waters. Let it divide the waters from the waters. God made the firmament, divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament, and it was so in Genesis 1. And we know then that this is a statement of something that's going on in the context of the firmament. Now, we'll look at a few references here to see if it sheds any more light on the significance of what a solid portion of the firmament might be. We are looking at Job here, 37:18. Thou hast made an expanse with him, of course, God, for the clouds, strong as a hard mirror. And the hard mirror is the word that I'm focusing on here. It's more than just a separation. There's something else involved, as if it were hammered out, or a hammered out sheet. The literal interpretation of rakia is hammered out in a sheet like a piece of metal. But I think we're talking about three concepts in this portion of the scripture. I think we're talking about the formation of the atmosphere above the earth, the formation of outer space as well, and a canopy of separating the atmosphere from the outer space, which is also a portion of this firmament concept. After this, he said he placed the heavens, the atmosphere, over the whole world, which is the earth, separated it from the other parts of outer space, determined that it should by itself be placed a crystalline firmament around it. Crystalline or solid, you may say, at this point. Put it together in a manner agreeable to the earth, filled it for giving moisture and rain, for affording the advantage of dews. Now that comes from Josephus. And it's interesting that Josephus' account is very explicit about the nature of this canopy thing. Scripture gives us an implication, but Josephus is pretty specific in what he's saying about it. And of course, Josephus is not scripture, but all of Josephus' writings have always been paralleled quite closely with biblical account, and the scholars have revered that for a long time. So we have every reason not to doubt Josephus' writings in this regard. If it's say God made a firmament, its thickness being 3 fingers between the limits of heaven and the atmosphere, the waters of the oceans. That's come from Broca and the translations of the Togmas and the rabbinic literature. I don't know about the 3 fingers, whether that would be taken literally or not, but it's maybe just an order of magnitude of that the firmament is a fairly thin canopy here. Okay, so, oops, sorry. Ezekiel 22:27 and 10:1 also speaks of an expanse. The living creatures, remember the seraphim, that is over the earth. It was crystalline. It had an awesome color like a sapphire stone, and it appeared copper color if the encircling fire was viewed through it. So if this crystalline expanse had a magenta, pinkish purple color, it would indeed appear to be copper colored if you viewed it through a red-orange flame, without any doubt. That comes from a Young's translation, literal translation of the Holy Bible. So now, based upon what we have in some indications from Scripture and the other supporting literature, particularly from Josephus, it appears that we are talking about 3 aspects of the firmament, as I mentioned just a few minutes ago, that we have the atmosphere over the earth, we have the outer portion of space, and a canopy of some solid type of system that is separating the upper atmosphere from the outer portions of the space. So this crystalline substance will suggest it has a unique magenta color. This has also been substantiated by some reports given to Dr. Carl Barr of the color of the light that's being used in his barometric experiments. The wavelength of that light is 643 nanometers, and that gives you the purplish pink color, the magenta hue of that color. And we do find in nature a natural silicate called sugilite, which has colors that range from pink to magenta to purple to brown, depending upon how the stones are formed and in what areas they're found. Now, I don't think there are a lot of areas where sugilite is found. The sources I found were both in African locations, but I think there's other locations such as in Japan and maybe a few others, but it's not a really abundant silicate, and that's why it's regarded as at least a semi-precious, and in ancient times it was regarded as a precious stone. So the formulation of that substance is right here. As you can see, it contains sodium, potassium, and some iron, the Fe in the 3+ state, and the manganese in the 3+ state. And we highlighted that on purpose because it's important. Aluminum, lithium, silicon, and oxygen. So it is a silicate, being an Si 12030 structure of a cristobalite type silicate. And it contains these ions, iron and manganese, manganese being particularly important because it's the one that seems to have been reported from the literature to be responsible for the color. So if the sugilite is blended from the data given in the literature with about 92% of the pink variety and adding about 28% of the purple variety, you can formulate a substance of sugilite that would exactly have the optical properties in the magenta region of the spectrum. So the absorption peak there is about 653, which is in the right neighborhood as being the right color for the magenta color. And this is discussed in some detail in the book, by the way. So I'm leaving off the details of that in this presentation. The chemical formula for this is called, is represented rather by this, sodium and potassium in these ratios, aluminum, iron, manganese, sodium. Now notice the manganese is a very small amount, only 0.38 relative to the iron, which is 3.6 times more. And of course aluminum and everything else is much greater than the manganese. But that little bit of manganese in the structural formula goes a long way to controlling the color, as had been proved in the literature. And we have references to that literature in the book, by the way. So we also want to make note of the fact that the iron and the manganese together have unpaired electrons in them, and those unpaired electrons cause paramagnetism, meaning they can be attracted into a magnetic field. So if you have a sufficiently strong magnetic field, say coming from the Earth, certainly these ions in this sugilite would interact with that field, and a force would be directed toward that substance from the Earth's magnetic field. So we would envision that as a force pushing against the canopy, directed away by the field interacting with those ions in the canopy if it's made out of this material here. And balancing against the pull of gravity, pulling the canopy inward. So we have to look at the consequences of what that situation might be based upon this model. We consider a location of about 11 miles above the Earth's surface, and that's based upon the suggestion that there's a heat sink between 10 and 11 miles above the Earth's surface, and it would be, according to information that had been given to Dr. Carl Barr down in Glen Rose from NASA, a reasonable place to expect a canopy to be located. Now the thickness, that was pretty much just undecided at the point, but the only suggestion we had was to keep it fairly thin, so just 2 centimeters just seemed to come up. It's slightly less than an inch. It takes 2.5 centimeters to make an inch, so slightly under an inch. So it's not a very thick canopy. The area of it is 6.43 times 10 to the 14 square meters. The volume is about 9 times 10 to the 12 cubic meters. The density is 2,700 kilograms per cubic meter. In fact, the density of sugilite goes all the way up to about 2,800, depending upon the sample. This one we'll consider a low density form. And then the mass, about 2.5 times 10 to the 16 kilograms. So We then envisioned that to place on this canopy layers of gold on the outer and inner edges, surfaces, and that would be about 2 nanometers thick, being that 2 nanometers thick of gold still keeps gold in perfectly transparent, and it's of course going to be therefore covering a transparent crystalline sugar light, which keeps the whole system virtually transparent. Now here are the results of calculating the forces on the canopy from the pull of gravity and the Earth's magnetic field. You notice that this is the order of 2.5 times 10 to the 17 power newtons with the negative sign pulling inward. And here is the order of 2.3 times 10 to the 17 newtons with the positive sign pushing against it, virtually balancing out these two forces to keep the canopy in place. Now, to tell you the truth, it was quite surprising, since we didn't know exactly what the thickness of 2 centimeters might be, right or wrong. Does it have to be thicker? Does it have to be thinner? But this is the way it works out with that dimension of the canopy as presented here. And it's rather surprising to see that these two forces balance out the way they do. It came as quite a surprise to me and to my associate Eric Baxter as well, but nonetheless, that's the way it turned out. Whether we want to consider that God-inspired or coincidental or whatever, we're happy that it worked out that way. In fact, it wouldn't take much of an adjustment to make it exact. If you only had 1.09 times more paramagnetic ions in there, meaning making that canopy just a little bit thicker, you could actually balance it out exactly. So it's right in the right ballpark to be balanced out. Now, when the canopy is balanced out, then we have remember the current conditions. 25 Gauss for the Earth's magnetic field as opposed to about 133 times 10 to the 3 Gauss at the core, which would have been, roughly the pre-flood conditions. And then at the surface, as I said, varying somewhere between 367 and maybe 535, depending upon where the origin of the field is considered. Still within reasonable range of tolerance. Magnetic fields of this strength are not detrimental to life at all. In fact, if you Google the effects of magnetic fields on living things, you will find a report given by Eric Christian down here from NASA, who says that these are actually more beneficial rather than detrimental. In fact, he said if it were detrimental, no one could ever go through a nuclear magnetic resonance imaging machine, because the strength of the magnetic fields there are thousands of, many thousands of Gauss involved there. And so what we're saying is, unless it's an extremely intense magnetic field that persists, could it ever be harmful to living things? But a stronger field at the Earth's surface than it is today would have actually probably been more beneficial than it is today. Okay. Russell Humphreys has shown that the Earth's field at the time of the flood, as we said before, went through these wild oscillations. So that would have accounted for the field being changed right after the flood. And all the details of these calculations are provided in the book in the second addendum. Now, the spectrum of the canopy, to verify that we do have the right composition for the right color, is also calculated in the book in detail. And it was found that it gives very excellent agreement. The results of the calculation, nearly perfect agreement actually, with the spectral assignment for the magenta color. So the 6,530 nanometer wavelength is an energy of about 1.9 electron volts, which a calculated value was 1.88 electron volts, which is very close to being correct. So If you're interested in that sort of thing, and you're able to comprehend that, it's pretty detailed and involved, but it's there for you to look at. Okay, here are the results that would presumably be with the conditions in the atmosphere of the Earth in the pre-flood condition with the canopy versus the post-flood condition with no canopy. So as you can see, the oxygen content is raised to about 25% from almost 21% as it is today. The nitrogen content is dropped a little bit to 74% as opposed to 78% as it is today. The atmospheric carbon dioxide is envisioned to be about 0.3%, pretty constant, and this is about 100 times smaller, 0.036 being the average, although now they have, this CO2 pollution business of the atmosphere causing global warming is believing that it's going up substantially, but it's really not. That's another issue which we won't address today. Probably would have been no argon initially, because most of the argon comes from radiometric decay anyway, and that probably would have been gassed out as the Earth had formed. But now in today's atmosphere, it's almost 1% by volume, 0.93. The water vapor would have been fairly confined to between 53 and 63, 60 rather, in the volume percent, as opposed to 0 to 4% as it varies today. And relative humidity varying between 60 and 70%, so fairly constant relative humidity envisioned here, whereas we know the relative humidity of today's Earth varies substantially with seasons and locations on the Earth. Temperatures would be fairly bracketed in between a low of 72 in the evening and at night to a high of about 78 in the day, which are these results were given to Dr. Carl Barr from some work that had been done by some people at NASA. So these are not my results or Baxter's results. These come from other sources. We know today the water vapor's temperature rather is widely variable in the Earth. And the pressure would have been around 22 psi, which is significantly higher in the atmosphere as opposed to 14.7 psi, which it is today. So those would be the comparisons that we would make. And the conclusion that we would draw from this study, as we presented in the book, has been that the crystalline canopy as a concept has been scientifically vindicated as a valid model for a part of the pre-flood firmament, the Rakia. And that really is the bottom line of what we wanted to talk about today. So remember this point, the waters that God initially created from the materials of composition according to our model, or the waters of creation also served as water of destruction. But then again, don't forget, God is involving his miraculous input in all things. So we can't answer everything scientifically. We can only try to model the science according to the Word of God, which in my belief is the only way really to go in modeling things for creationism. Thank you for your time and your attention, and appreciate the opportunity to speak to you. Well, we did have a few questions from the audience here. One of the questions was regarding the dynamic stability of this canopy as it is in conjunction with the atmosphere and the Earth. Now remember, the Earth is rotating, and the concept that we have here is that the canopy is in equilibrium with the Earth. The forces are balanced out, so as the Earth rotates rather slowly, the canopy also rotates with it. And the atmosphere in between the Earth's surface and the canopy is more or less only subject to the rotation of what's going around as the Earth and the canopy move about in a circular fashion. We don't know for sure whether the frictional forces of the atmosphere against the canopy surface would be detrimental to it or not. In fact, we're considering that right now to see if we can come up with an order of magnitude of what the effect might be, if it would be any significance in destabilizing that canopy. The other question was the thermal distortion with regard to the Earth's shadow. Now, that's a more difficult question to answer. I don't know that we necessarily have all the information required at hand to be able to model that very well, but it's a consideration that we have to keep in mind. How much thermal distortion would there actually be? And there again, as the frictional force of atmosphere against the canopy, would the thermal distortion of the Earth's shadow be significant enough to damage the canopy or to destroy the canopy? The third question had to do with a greenhouse effect as radiation from the sun enters in underneath the canopy into the Earth's surface and is radiated back as infrared radiation. Now, the only thing we know at this point is that sugarlight, crystals like sugarlight, and gold for that matter, are very excellent infrared absorbers, and there have been some studies in the recent literature to show that their ratio of scattering in the long wavelength visible and infrared regions of the spectrum are very efficient in scattering to absorption ratios. The extent to which re-radiating back from the Earth's surface onto the canopy surface would heat the interior significantly is, of course, a significant question for releasing that heat. Don't know exactly how much infrared radiation would actually be radiated back, because conditions may have been somewhat different at that point in time as they are today. However, it is a significant point to keep in mind. Now, the fact that the modeled system given by the engineers from NASA having a temperature within 72 to 78 degrees pretty constant indicates there wouldn't be much thermal heating in terms of a significant greenhouse effect anyway. The last question I had here is with regard to the collapse of the canopy at the time of the flood. Well, there's no question the canopy would have been collapsed. In my way of thinking, it actually would have been blown apart explosively. So I'm thinking that it would have been fractured into smithereens, more or less powdered, you might say. So that remains of that canopy would have been scattered over the Earth and into the oceans and whatever. And it's just absorbed into the entire Earth's surface and the oceans with no more trace of where it was originally, because maybe the reasons for traces of sugar light being concentrated in more areas of the world than in others, and not that prevalent over the whole Earth as a whole. But there's only points of observation. Don't know that for sure. So there are some, unanswered questions to the entire model. The main purpose of the study, of course, was to show whether our model is feasible, and we think it is. If we can, of course, address the additional questions with adequacy, we will certainly do so. This paper, by the way, has been accepted for presentation at the International Creation Conference in 2013. Well, I say it's been accepted. The paper has been accepted. It hasn't been approved yet, but the approval has to come. But at least it's potentially geared for presentation in that conference in 2013. So it'll be interesting to see what responses we get out of the others in the conference regarding the same questions that were brought up here from the audience, which are all excellent questions and deserve attention. Thank you again, and hope to see you again soon. So long. Hi, I'm Dr. Ed Boudreaux. president of Rocky Mountain Creation Fellowship. I was a professor of chemistry and chemical physics at the University of New Orleans before we got blown away by Hurricane Katrina back in 2005 and came here to Colorado. So it's been a blessing to be here and to be part of this organization. And I'm really pleased to be able to address you again on the topic regarding a new book called God Created the Earth. Some of you may remember a prior presentation I made a number of months ago when the first edition of the book was published, and I discussed an overview of the contents of the book. At that time, the issue of Canopy above the earth was not included in the book, but in the recent second edition that's come out earlier this year, we do have that as a second addendum to the book, which is a topic that we will address today. Now, prior to getting into the discussion of the Canopy model, we have to backtrack a little bit to the origin and the nature of the Earth's magnetic field. And that will be the first topic of discussion. In the model that we have presented for the formation of the Earth, remember, water was the key substance that God had created right at the beginning of day one. And we envisioned that water to be transformed into a plasma, most of it. And that was forming, well, eventually would form all the chemical elements and the substances that we needed to form the Earth, as well as everything else in the universe, as Russell Humphrey believes, that the water of the universe is out even on the outer edges of the universe, which we can't even detect anymore. But it was the source of all the material composition of the universe. Well, a portion of that water should have been set aside somewhere in the region of the mantle and the core that would be, available to do its work in the properties that we're going to discuss regarding the Earth's magnetic field. But the high core temperature cancels out this magnetism because it's above what's called the Curie point. And at the Curie point, if you go beyond the Curie point, rather, the ferromagnetic properties of any substance will be lost, and you will have no longer the magnetism of that was available originally. The outer core has presumably a composition of essentially nonmetals, silicon, oxygen, phosphorus, and hydrogen. Basically, this formulation was considered to be the composition by Magdana, and that has a much lower density of about 1.7 grams per cubic centimeter, as you can see right here. So we have these components in the outer core, but it's believed that there are some ionized atoms within that molten medium of the outer core which circulate around the inner core, and that creates a dynamo via the Faraday effect for the electric field to be induced into the inner core as a magnetized system. And that would be the source of the core field, which at this point in time in the Earth is only about 25 Gauss and about a half a Gauss at the surface. So it's a pretty weak field now. The question is, was it always a weak field? And here's the model that was proposed by Baxter and me, based upon the plasma Earth concept, that the portion of the water of the creation was set aside naturally for the lakes and the oceans and so on, but there was an additional portion that was committed to the region, interior region of the Earth in the mantle core area, and those subterranean waters would be part of the waters of the fountains of the deep that the Bible speaks about. And we also have some relevant evidence from fairly recent data that it suggests that there is a body of water in that mantle region of the core, which is as big as maybe the Arctic Ocean. So it's a fairly sizable amount of water even there today. So if we consider that water in the inner core and the temperature of the core approaching a pretty, of course, the original temperature, remember, was much higher than the million. Now, current status is that based on seismic data It's presumed that the core is primarily composed of iron and nickel, plus some lesser amounts of different elements, and only because the waves reflect a density that fits a model alloy of that kind of composition. The source that I considered to be pretty reliable and complete is by McDonough, whose data says that the formula for the substance in the inner core would be this Fe 200 parts nickel, 12 parts silicon, 7 parts, and chromium 2 parts, having a density of about 7.48 grams per cubic centimeter at 1 atmosphere of pressure. However, as the pressure gets enormously elevated, you know, density will increase tremendously in the neighborhood of 10 to 11 grams per cubic centimeter, which is what the core density is believed to be now. Now, the inner core is actually ferromagnetic because of the presence of the iron and the nickel, and the electrons that are there align themselves to form a ferromagnet.